In a second here, I'll do reintroductions if anybody doesn't know, myself and Peter working on the project. But we'll also introduce those that are on the committee, Pete, Charlie, who else is on the committee? Anybody in the back? Anybody hiding back there? Okay, so a couple other committee members couldn't be here tonight. I know the mayor will be coming up shortly. So we're here to present kind of interim set of findings as part of the overall municipal restructuring study that we've been working on. This is the second public meeting. There will be more following, but we wanted to get out and kind of present the thinking that we've had. So I'll preempt all of the kind of discussion that we'll have with the statement that what we're about to present is an early stage set of plans around a police restructuring of the police services. So in our original plan for the project, we said, look, we're going to look at both service reorganization and municipal reorganization. We're at the point in the process where we're still looking at the service reorganization with a focus on police. When we finish with that process, after today and after future discussion on this with our committee and finalizing the report on this piece, then we'll shift to look at municipal restructuring. And so I'll walk you through that timeline in just a second here. Our agenda for tonight, I want to go through the study basics, provide a summary of the existing conditions report. This is a report that we presented to the steering committee about a month ago. We'll present the basic findings from that. That's available online that you can take a look at. And then we'll talk about the police reorganization part of the plan. And so again, we'll provide you with an overview of our initial set of analyses and recommendations, have your questions and feedback. This is not a final presentation on that subject. This is a presentation to gather your input. And then we'll talk about the next steps from here, and then we'll have a period for question and answer at the end. You know, I guess it's a relatively small group, so if there are some questions as we move along, raise your hand, and if we can get to them, we will. But if you have a long question or want to make any statements related to the study, I'd ask you to hold those to the end so that we can get through the presentation, and then we'll have a period for question and discussion. So hold your comments for the end, unless there's something that we can clarify as we're going through. So I'm Tim Wiedemann. Rondout Consulting is my company. Richard, my brother, actually works with me at the firm, and we've been working on this project. Richard was here for the last public meeting. Those of you that were at that public meeting, he couldn't join us today. We're the project managers for the project, and then doing the meeting facilitation and the analysis and recommendations. And Peter is with me tonight. Peter, you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's Peter Carroller, Reorg Consulting, and I'm helping out with the project, reviewing some of the findings, looking at some of the questions related to some legal aspects, things of that sort.
Okay, so a quick review. What is this local government reorganization study that we're going through? Really, it's designed to answer a series of questions, and these were put together in a grant application that the village submitted to the state. Rob Rokel is here from the Department of State, one of the reps in their local government program. There's a local government efficiency grant program that the village applied for and received funding, and in that application identified a series of things that they wanted to look at. In fact, the main thrust of the grant application, which is why we'll return after we look at police and the services to the municipal reorganization, the main thrust was an actual full municipal reorganization looking at village dissolution or consolidation of the town and the village. So we will come back to that. That's kind of a separate topic that we'll look at the next after we get through the service reorganization. So the questions, yeah?
It's a 50-50 grant, right?
Yes.
So
50.
the village put a half in and the state put a half in.
Yep, and the program that the Department of State offers, if the village moves ahead with a consolidation, then they're eligible for a kind of rebate, a recoup of some of those 50% matching funds that they provided.
Okay.
So the questions we're going to look at, what are the services that are provided first and foremost in the village? This is relevant both to talking about individual services, which we'll do tonight, but also to the full municipal reorganization study that we'll do before the study ends. And then we'll look at what are the other ways that citizens can receive those services. And so that's part of what we'll talk about tonight. What are some other ways that police services could be provided to the village residents? And then importantly, the reason that we're here really is to look at what the impact of those changes would be, to figure out how they impact local control over the services that are provided, how they impact budgets and through budgets taxes, how they affect municipal employees, how they affect softer things like a sense of community. All of those are parts of the feasibility and impact study that we do as we go through this process. And we'll start to kind of talk in real detail about the impact of police reorganization on the taxes, a little bit on the local control, and on the municipal employees as well. So that's part of what we'll cover tonight. So the study goals, we wanted to look at 3 different things in the study. We wanted to look for ways for the town and the village to reduce costs. We wanted to look at ways for the town and the village to improve services, but it's more than that. It's also about really creating an opportunity for a discussion within the community, and that's part of what our hope is tonight. We're going to present some stuff to you. Some of it may be stuff that you have strong reactions to. That's okay. We want that input, and it'll be a continuing discussion as we get through today and have future public meetings. So hopefully we can have a bit of a discussion as we go through today. And to that end, when I get into some of the technical stuff in here, it may be a little confusing. Remember, I've done a lot of this, and my head kind of gets deep into it, so if anything doesn't make sense, feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to clarify. This is the complicated chart that is our schedule. It's shifted a little since we began the study back in January. We've had a much longer process in the service reorganization part, really diving in deep, collecting a lot of data and looking at that data to really understand, importantly, the two major services, the two major in terms of cost are police and highway DPW. And so we've spent a lot of our time looking at those two major services. It compresses the rest of this study into a relatively short time frame, but I think we can do that. We've gotten through, I think, the really nitty-gritty part of collecting all the data, and I think now through the meetings that we'll have tonight and in the future, we'll be able to present some findings fairly quickly and gather your reactions and finalize the study and the plans. So there are 2 more public meetings that are scheduled before the end of the year, and at those meetings we'll review the full municipal reorganization. So we're talking about services. We'll have another public meeting to review the municipal reorganization part, and then we'll have a final public meeting to close out the project and review all of the stuff together and gather final input. So our work over the last couple of months has been identifying the services that are provided now in the village and really getting into detail about what those services look like and how they are similar to or different from the services provided in the town. So the end result of our service inventory, which is that effort to identify the services and compare them, identified really 6 sub-services of police. Within the police department, there's work that's done in administration and planning, largely by the chief, clerical and record keeping by either clerks or dispatchers, the dispatch itself, law enforcement, the core kind of control work, investigations, and then traffic control. And so this is an important part of this process so we can understand where there's similarities and differences between the town and the village. So for instance, dispatch right now in the town handled through 911 rather than in the village where it's handled by full-time dispatchers. And so an important distinction in the way that services are provided in the 2 communities. Any questions about this? It's kind of a laundry list, but this is in greater detail if you're interested in our existing conditions report, which is up on the website. As part of that, we also identified the organization structure currently and the staffing currently within each of the 2 police departments. And so this is what we find when we look at the structure within the Highland Falls Village Police Department and the Highlands Town Police Department. So you'll see chief in the village oversees 3 full-time dispatchers and a pool of part-time dispatchers, oversees 2 sergeants, a pool of 5 full-time and 13 part-time officers and 1 detective. In the town, the chief oversees really all part-time force, part-time clerk, and then 3 part-time, they're called detectives, they're really kind of the equivalent of a sergeant in terms of their administrative responsibilities, and then pools of part-time officers to round out the schedule and provide coverage. Any questions? So, through the existing conditions report, we identified what the cost is of each of those services within the police department in each of the 2 municipalities. And so this is really where the majority of the time and energy has been over the last couple of months. We've gone through and looked at the municipal budgets, line by line, and then had conversations with the chiefs in each of the 2 departments, and we're able to allocate the line items in the budget to these services to get an estimate of what the cost of each of the services is. And so it's a little small, but you'll see up here we've got an estimate for the village of Highland Falls that administration and planning is about $110,000, clerical and record keeping is about $333,000, dispatch about $214,000, law enforcement and patrol is the bulk of the budget at $1.3 million, $382,000 in investigations, and a small $26,000 in traffic control, for a total cost for police services of about $2.4 million. And so, yeah, Chief Scott.
All right, so just so I understand, these are new numbers to me. So you have $110,000 for admin and planning. Where's that number coming from?
So, good question. So this gives me an opportunity to explain how this is different from what you would see if you go pull up the village's budget and go to the line items in the budget. In the budget, you'll see one line for police salaries. And so what this does is it takes police salaries and allocates them out to the services. And so we've gone through and we've estimated portions of time that people spend on this based on our early conversations. Chief Scott, how much time does a patrol officer spend on doing investigations rather than patrol, and how much paperwork, administrative work? So for instance, that administrative cost takes into account some of the patrol officers' salaries. A small percentage of that goes to administration and planning for the paperwork and administrative work that they do. And so this is an exercise that generates numbers that are, I can see your kind of scrunched up forehead there. They're a little different than what you would see looking at the budget. They're designed to try to say what's the kind of real world cost of the service, not just the line items in the budget, but in particular, the one that makes the biggest difference is that we take things like insurance and health insurance and other benefits, which are now if you go look at the village budgets, those are all in their own set of lines in the budget that cover the whole operation of the village. And we've taken those and we've allocated those out to personnel. And so, for instance, this law enforcement and patrol amount here is a combination of the actual salaries of the patrol officers, but then a portion of the benefits that's proportional to their salaries as well. And so it ends up, what it does is it creates what seems like an inflated cost, which, just understand that that's what's going on here. The reason it's inflated is because it's the first attempt that most communities take to actually look at the fully allocated cost of the services. So if you were to look at like the clerk's office, you would see the same kind of thing, that the clerk in the line items in their budget would add up to some number. If we did this similar exercise, it would come out to something higher than that because you're allocating the unallocated cost to it. So that's a long explanation, but that's what's going on here. Yeah.
How do you arrive at the $382,000 figure for investigation?
Again, taking the detective for one, but then taking a portion of all of the patrol officers' times that they spend on investigating. Usually the kind of immediate follow-up after an incident. The larger investigations are obviously happening either through the detective or through the state police or the sheriff's office. But that's allocating a portion of the full salary of all the police officers for the time that they spent doing investigations. Yeah. Jim.
Does anybody audit your figures so that you're not double adding? Like if you have the same dollars in admin and planning as the same dollars in law enforcement patrols, the same dollars in investigations?
We reconcile it to the total budget of the municipality. So there is no double counting of dollars. They're moved into other categories because we're looking at services rather than just the budget line items. But we're not double counting dollars. And if anybody wants to kind of check the math and really look at how this is done, the existing conditions report has a whole appendix that literally goes service by service and presents every single line item from the budget and the percentages that we use to assign. And so if you want to look, you can do it, and if you have feedback on it or a question about it, you can submit those through the website, or I can give my email address at the end, and if you want to send a question, you can reach out. Yeah.
So $2.3 million. Should the village get rid of its police department, how are we going to see that savings in the village budget?
Let me get to that, because that's the heart of what I'm here to kind of present. But when I get through this existing condition stuff, which is kind of what is the situation now, then I'm going to present our first cut at an analysis of what a consolidated police department would look like. And that'll answer that question. Let me just quickly say that in the town of Highlands, you can see that the totals for each of those services, first of all, dispatch is zero. They don't actually have a cost for dispatch because it's handled through 911. And so the total cost comes to $788,000 for the town's service. And now, an important factor just related to budgets here. If you go look at the town budget, police falls within the part-town fund, so that's the B fund in the town's funds. And right now, it's actually the whole fund budget, the whole levy for that fund is less than $788,000, which would make the average person kind of crazy, because how can we be saying that the cost of police service is $788,000, but they're only levying $400,000 or something to the taxpayers? It's because, that's where their sales tax sharing, their portion of the sales tax comes in as another revenue stream into that fund. So that means they have to raise less from the property taxes for that fund. So keep that in mind. This is actually our estimate of the true cost. It's covered in large part for the town by their sales tax revenues. So when you combine those two, you get $3.2 million is the combined cost of police services in the two municipalities. And that's an important number that we'll come back to, because that's the one that we really want to see some reduction in it, ideally. That's kind of the objective of the study, is to figure out a way to reduce cost, but at the same time to not eliminate services, not reduce the quality of services that are provided. So we'll come back to that number. Similar thing that I'll move through quickly for Public Works. We're actually not going to talk too much today about our recommendations for any consolidation of Public Works. We really wanted to focus on police first, have that conversation, and then come back to Public Works. But you can see we've laid the same groundwork. We've identified a series of 7 services actually that fall under the umbrella of Public Works. There's street and road maintenance, snow plowing and removal, shop and equipment maintenance, beautification and refuse collection, Department of Administration, parks maintenance, and then buildings and grounds maintenance. And so in the 2 municipalities, these kind of fall out in different ways in terms of who's responsible for them, but they are the typical suite of services that are called DPW, Public Works, and so we've included them all in here. We've done a similar organization structure, looking at what is the staffing and who's assigned to these things right now. The main focus here, you'll see, as a highway department, is on highways, the street and road stuff, but there's also the sanitation, because the town does the refuse collection, and so that's a big portion of the town's operation when it comes to DPW. So in the cost analysis that we did, we found that in the Village of Highland Falls, a total cost for these DPW services of about $1.2 million. And then if you look at the town, the cost is actually allocated into different funds for different things. So in the general fund, we have the cost for the shop and the equipment maintenance, the beautification, and importantly, the refuse collection. That bumps that up significantly. The Department of Administration, the parks maintenance, and the buildings and grounds maintenance. In the highway fund that's town-wide, so another town-wide fund, but this time the highways fund specifically, we have the snow plowing and removal, and the shop equipment and maintenance. And then finally, in the Park-Town Highway Fund, we have the actual street maintenance. So that's reflecting the fact that the town's responsibility when it comes to street maintenance is really for only the roads outside of the village, and so they allocate the cost of that maintenance to only the area outside of the village. Total, that comes to about $1.5 million, and so combined, it's about $2.7 million for DPW services.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
I see for snowplow removal that for the village, it's $316,000, and yet for the town, it's $70,000. Could you bridge that?
Yeah, well, I can tell you my understanding and the kind of general sense of what causes that kind of difference typically between towns and villages. And that is that snow plowing and removal in a village is a much different operation than it is in a town. So there's lots of parked cars, and so that causes a challenge when it comes to plowing. And there's often sidewalks sometimes, and I can't remember if the village is responsible for any sidewalk snow removal, but occasionally that needs to happen if a property owner doesn't do it. And the equipment is also not geared towards a fast pass down a town road and then a pass back, so it can be a much more labor-intensive operation.
To the tune of $250,000?
And, you know, and I think this is true in the village too, yes, because especially if there's a heavy snow year and there's a need to actually remove the snow through a snow blower or through backhoes, that really increases costs very quickly, and so that's typically budgeted into the snow removal budget for a municipality like the village.
I think there's also, if you speak to Gary Boyce, he'll also tell you, I think there's twice or 3 times as many intersections.
Yeah.
It's just a time factor, and I think that's what, it just takes longer. That's, if you ask the highway superintendents, I'm just telling you what their answer is probably.
Just takes on 3 times as much, it seems like.
Yeah, and I'll say that is, we see that typically in municipalities, that there is a 2 to 3 times cost increase in village areas because of the nature of the road system in a village. And, you know, so I don't see that as atypical. It is a much higher cost in the village than the town. Was there another question?
Yeah, the column next to it
Yeah.
is shop and equipment maintenance.
Yep.
334 versus 49,000.
It's actually
Another huge.
Yeah, so 334 in the village, it is still huge, but it's actually 49 plus 50 in the town. They're allocated into different funds, but it's really 100,000 when you add those two together in the town. And so it is a different, a different factor. I think, in large part, what we find here, and this is kind of difficult to account for, the shop and equipment maintenance is really a shared function. They're not just maintaining highway and DPW equipment, they're often maintaining the police vehicles or the building code inspectors' vehicles. So there is a larger fleet for the police in the village, so that is part of the increase for the shop and equipment maintenance. And also, I want to say that do you guys have a mechanic, an actual full-time mechanic? So I think that there's some additional costs related to the allocation of the benefits and all that stuff that comes into that as well.
It's older too.
Yeah. Yeah, fleet's older,
The
yeah, I mean,
town's
that,
fleet
that
is much
can be an
younger.
influencing factor there too. Any questions, any other questions? Yeah.
Just more of an observation that you've already said it, but I really think you've got to hammer at it. I understand that what you did is you took retirement, you took health insurance, and you put it in, which is a very common municipal accounting practice.
Right.
But I think people are going to have a hard time wrapping their head around that number you just showed. So I just think people really need to understand why that looks like an inflated number
Yep.
used to what they're seeing. Because otherwise, I think they could walk away really misunderstanding what got said here.
Yeah, so I will say it again, which is that this is not a number that anyone, you'd have to do a lot of math with the village and town budgets to get to these numbers. But it's really important for a study like this to look at those fully allocated costs. Because if there is a change in employment, if somebody either, is shifted from the village to the town, that can affect the benefits, and so that can affect the cost. We need to understand what that is, and so that's why we allocate this stuff up front, to be able to understand those full costs. In the report that's up on the website, the problem here is that really explaining it takes some work to actually kind of look at those numbers and understand what this actually says. But the full details are there, and I'll just say that it's a valuable exercise for most communities to understand that when I add up the lines in any department in the budget, I am not looking at the actual cost of that department. That is not what a village budget or a town budget is designed to do. It's not designed to tell you the cost of a service. It's designed to tell you in these functional categories what are our planned expenditures. And so it's a different exercise that, unfortunately, it should be something that I think is more commonly understood by residents because it's an important thing to know. I want to know, how much does this service cost in my community? And, so we do have some work to do to explain it. The report hopefully does some of that, and we'll have to continue to do it in these meetings. Okay, so that's the baseline stuff. A lot more of it, including those detailed charts, are in the existing conditions report that's up on the website. I should say the website is at roundoutconsulting.highlandfalls.com. It's also a link on the town and the village websites that you can get to it. So feel free to go check that out. So now I'm going to talk about the police reorganization part of the study. And so we have met with the committee and talked about some of the options. We were asked to look at one of the particular options first, and so we've done that. We're going to report the results of that today and have a conversation with you about what those results look like, get your input and feedback. The three options that as we kind of look at any municipal restructuring related to police that are available are as follows, and I'll walk you through each of these. The first option for any community is to eliminate a service. That is an option that communities have, that some of them choose to take if that's really the only thing that they can do in terms of reducing the cost the way that they need to, or reorienting their department the way that they need to. It's a drastic option, but it's an option that's available. So in that case, if the police services were eliminated from the village, they would be handled in kind of basic fashion through other departments that have jurisdiction, and that is the town. Since the village is within the town, and within the town's jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of their police department, the town would be available to respond, the sheriff and the state police. Now, would they provide the level of service that the village now provides? Certainly not without some major change in the way that they operate. So the assumption would be that if the option was to eliminate the police services in the village, there would not be an expectation that those services would be fully taken on by other departments. They would respond in emergency situations as they're able to. And so, importantly, the challenge with this is that the levels of service that are provided are not directly then under the control of the village. And so that's the real challenge, and this is one of the things that we said we would look at in the study, and I think is one of the things that makes this a really challenging option that's probably not desirable. The other option is to create a contract with another of these municipalities. So in the event that the village's police services are eliminated, those could be replaced with services from any of those other jurisdictions. So a contract with the town or with the sheriff could provide some specifications of the level of services that are to be provided and how those services would be provided, and that's possible. That happens in other communities. There's that contract that defines the level of service, so you get a little bit of control over it, but it comes at a cost, because usually that means that there's some additional service that needs to be provided by the town or the sheriff, say, and that usually results in a cost that's associated with that contract. And importantly, it's also a matter of whether or not the other departments are willing and capable to provide the level of service that the village wants out of that contract. So those are important considerations that make it a fairly complicated option, one that you have to really be careful about the contract and how you spell that out and understand what the costs associated with that contract would be. And then finally, the other option is to create a merged police department between the town and the village. And so to take the operations of the two departments, look at how to kind of build them in together and consolidate them into a single department. And in this case, in most cases, in fact, the best option usually is to have the town be the one that kind of is the merged, the entity that the village merges into, because the town already has jurisdiction over the village, rather than the village trying to provide service outside of its boundaries. It's a more common and typical thing to see the village merge into the town police department. And then in this case, the benefit of this is that the levels of service are still determined through local control. That control is through the town board if it's a merger of the village into the town, but that's still a control through the local, local elections that village residents or town residents, they can have that say over that service that's being provided to them. So those are the three options, and there's variants on each of those options, kind of ways to shift them around a little bit, but those are the main three options. We looked in particular at the third option, thinking that it is probably the most desirable of the three options and one that we should look at in detail and figure out if it could work before we move on and look at any of the other options. So the goals that we set out as we looked at the option to try to figure out if this is an option that was viable and that was something that the communities could benefit from was a series of goals here. First is to attempt to address some of the current challenges in each of the two departments. And so we had some conversations with each of the chiefs and talked about what are the things that you think are working well, what are the things that are challenges. And I think this is not surprising, it's actually probably true in a lot of municipal departments, police or otherwise throughout the state, that it's tough to schedule, especially with a part-time force, trying to find people that are reliable and that can take the hours that are needed. Scheduling can be a challenge. Supervision in a small department, having qualified, trained staff that can provide supervision on all shifts during all days is a big challenge. And then having the administrative support to make sure that officers aren't bogged down with a lot of paperwork and stuff, that there's somebody to be able to take on that administrative work is another challenge as well. So the goal also was to look at ways related to that administrative support, particularly to free up the dispatchers for other clerical and administrative duties. So I think there's been some attrition within the dispatch function, and I believe there's already some discussions with the county about covering dispatch for certain shifts. And so the thought here is that really dispatch as a function is one that could be handled through the emergency services office, freeing up the quote-unquote dispatchers to handle a role as administrative support, clerks for the department, to be able to handle walk-ins, to be able to handle the administrative paperwork, to be able to handle non-emergency calls. And then as well, that has the benefit of kind of streamlining the call response system and the data collection system that would allow for the departments to collect better data about calls and call volumes and response times in order to help with future planning, to be able to make sure that that is available data that can help with that effort. And then for a merger, there's also an important goal here to provide a transition period. And this has been our experience in other communities, that you need to make sure that you don't cut to the bone or do something that's really drastic in the merger, because then if you do, it can be really difficult for the departments to adjust to that. And so if there is going to be a merger, it should be one that provides for a period of transition, provides extra coverage if needed, tries to ease into that consolidation, that merger, rather than doing it all drastically at once. And importantly, that it means really trying to handle any eliminated positions through attrition, rather than having a layoff or some change that results in somebody losing their job, to try to find opportunities if there are reductions in staff to handle those through attrition. And as we'll get to this in a little bit, to make sure that we have staffing levels that as we look at what's the need for staff, that we don't go with the minimum need, that we go with something beyond the minimum need, so that there is that cushion if things come up during the merger that demand people's time, that there is time available to address those. So we are here to present, really, our stab at what we think the staffing is. Staffing is the biggest question because staffing drives all the other costs, and it's the biggest cost by itself. And so we approach staffing as the first step to analyze what is a reasonable and viable option for a merged department. We fully expect that through some input from Chief Scott and from Chief Quinn, there could be revisions to this. They've looked at consolidation a couple times in the last few years, and so we have their previous reports and looked at those as part of the input in how we design a merged department. but we'll be interested in the reaction that you all have and hear the conversations with our committee and with the chiefs. So our method here, let me just explain, is first to calculate a base staffing requirement. So we look at call volumes from the blotter, figure out what is the number of officers at a minimum that's required to respond to the volume of calls in each shift over the course of the year. And so that's the absolute base requirement. And then from there, we try to inform the scheduling with a performance objective. This has to do with how much time should an officer be using responding to calls rather than proactively providing service or doing administrative tasks, that kind of thing. And so we want to make sure that an officer isn't responding to a call and then immediately having to turn around and respond to another call and never getting a time to do any of the other work that's an important part of police and law enforcement. So then the third step is that there's a shift relief factor, so you can't have people working 24/7 every day in the year, so we need to figure out if we need a certain number of officers, how many extra do we need to fill in for scheduled, vacations, sick time, holidays, that kind of stuff. And then finally, let's look at what that gives us and figure out how it works with scheduling overall, and is there a viable schedule that could work with that staffing level. So those are the 4 steps in the process, and let me show you those steps as we go through them each. So the first thing we looked at is the blotter to look at call volumes. We sorted out and identified the calls, the items on the blotter that represent calls for service rather than either proactive opportunities for the patrol officers to get out there and do something self-directed rather than reactive. And then we also pulled out administrative tasks, that kind of stuff, and looked at really just the calls for service, the emergency calls, the calls that require a response. And you can see a few different lines on here. The different colors are from different years. We looked at 2013, 14, and 15. And then the dotted black line here is an average of those 3 years. And so you can see at midnight to 2 a.m., there were a total of about 300 calls on average over the course of a year. And then it was pretty quiet through the early morning hours with a jump in activity around the 8 o'clock hour and continuing through the day, a peak just after 6 p.m., and then a decline and a further decline through the end of the day. And so when we look at that and we say, look, there were, say, 300 calls at between the hours of 12 a.m. and 2 a.m., and we actually used an estimate, kind of a national estimate, and so we can massage this, tweak this if it's needed, but we used an estimate of about 35 minutes on average per call to respond to the issue. And so if you look at that, that generates a total demand over the course of the year for only 0.26 officers, so less, or about a quarter of an officer just in terms of responding to the call volume during this window of time from 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. Jumps up to 0.66 officers during the shift from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. and then about 6 officers from shift from 4 p.m. to midnight. Any questions on that?
Yeah, that's how it falls only. What about
Yep.
the town of Highland?
We actually don't have the call data for the town of Highland, so we didn't do the same analysis for the town of Highland, and we'll come back to the staffing for town of Highland in a little bit.
Alright.
But this was the analysis for the village, and so this looks at what's the village requirement to respond to the calls in the village.
Tim?
Yeah.
So why don't you have that information from the town? Would you have to go to the 911 to
Yeah.
get that information?
Yep, yeah,
Okay.
and we haven't done that yet, we haven't been able to get that data yet, so we haven't done the same analysis. And we can talk about what that means, and I think we've got, as we get further along in here, I think we've got some ways to handle it even without that, but we can see what your reactions are and see what you think.
Well, just to follow up.
Yeah.
Does that mean that if somebody called 911 and a village police officer responded, he wouldn't be in those numbers?
No, I believe those are counted in your blotter. Your blotter is kind of reactive tracking of officers' activity, so those would be counted in here.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the first step, establishing the base requirement. Now we have this performance goal thing that says, look, we don't want to have 100% of an officer's time dedicated to responding to calls. They have other things that they need to be able to do. We started out with what's a fairly standard goal of saying that no more than 60% of an officer's time should be dedicated to responding to calls for services. That the rest of that, the 40% can be for self-directed patrol, for administrative stuff, paperwork, and for investigations, the immediate follow-up investigations that aren't handled by a detective or by the state police, any of those. And so when you do that, then we have to take this base requirement and increase it, because if we've got, say, 0.66 officers, but we only want to use 60% of their time for patrol, then we need to increase the number in order to cover the base requirement, and that's these numbers on the final side here. So now we see that during shift 1, which is 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., instead of 0.66, which the previous slide said, we actually need 1.1. And in shift 2, instead of 0.59, we need 0.98. Shift 3, 0.26 becomes 0.43. So that's the performance goal part. And this is kind of a fungible goal that we'll talk about in a minute, that I think we can actually do better than this goal, that we can reduce the amount of time that officers are required to respond to calls for service and increase the amount of self-directed time, which is desirable. I mean, that's a good thing. This is, kind of proactive policing rather than reactive policing. The further we can decrease this down to a reasonable amount, obviously you want people to be largely responding to calls, but the more we can reduce this and increase this, the better it is for kind of proactive policing. Okay, so the third step in this is to calculate the shift relief factor. And so this says that we got to cover when people are on vacation, on sick time. We took the benefits from the contract for the village and found that there's a total of 1,302 hours that they can have off as a maximum if they take all their vacation, all their sick time in a year, and have training of about 70 hours per year. And then the regular days off is just weekends, or the 2 days per week that the shift would allow them off. And so that comes out of the total number of hours that any officer can work in a year. So that's the total hours are 8 hours per day, 365 per year. That's 2,920 hours. So each officer has off that 1,302 hours. And so that means each officer is working 1,618 hours, basically. And so that equates to 1.8 full-time officers in order to fill each one full-time equivalent officer. We need 1.8 people in the schedule to fill one full-time position 365 days per year. Does that make sense?
Are we on the analysis right now as before? This is just the village you're talking about?
This is the village, yeah?
Just strictly the village, we're not talking about the town?
Right, just the village, not the town.
Okay.
Also, isn't this a little deceiving in that these are averages? What happens when there's serious accident? An Army football game, an event that is hosted in the town or village, where all hands are on deck?
Yeah.
How do you account for those?
The same way that is done now, that if there's a need for a special detail or somebody brought on as part-time in the need for a high demand, something that you can plan for, then it's something that the departments would use part-time or bring people in off of their shifts. Same process it would be now. There's always going to be times when there's a demand in excess of what the normal schedule calls for.
I got a question. Okay, you're talking about 911 calls. Now, less patrol means more crime. If somebody knows there's a policeman driving around checking on everything, they're not going to commit a crime. And then if they know there's no policeman around, they're going to say, it's a good time to commit a crime.
So I hear you, but I think what we're talking about here is actually 24/7 coverage, where, as I just said, we're looking at ways to be able to allow even more of the proactive patrol than is currently the case. So bear with me as we get through this, and let's see if we accomplish that with the things that we come up with here. But so let me continue the process here, the analysis that we did. So again, we have this base requirement, then we said, look, we want to spend no more than 60% of officers' times responding to calls so that they can have more time to be proactive. And then we said, look, each single full-time officer requires 1.8 full-time equivalent positions in order to cover all the schedule. So what that gets us to is a total required officers. We started at 0.66, 1.1, and now we're up with the shift relief factor to basically 2. And so we've got the required full-time officers for the village. In shift 1 is a minimum of 2. In shift 2, a minimum of 2, and shift 3, a minimum of 1, based on the call volumes and those factors that increase that from there. So that's the basic requirement for the village. What we did is for the town, we took basically the current coverage, and we said, look, if we're going to go through a merger process, the worst case scenario is that the town is going to need the same level of coverage as what they have now, in addition to what the village has. And so I think this is a pretty conservative estimate. I think as we look at the call volumes for the town, we could probably find that there may be some areas, some shifts, or some times when that may not be a required level of service, especially when we talk about a consolidation of the two departments. And so what we've done is we've said, look, this is the minimum requirement for the village. Now let's add in what the town already has, and let's assume that that's the minimum for this merged department that we're thinking about hypothetically. And so what that says is that on each shift, the first 2 shifts, you need a minimum of 3.6 full-time equivalent positions, a minimum of 3.6 on shift 2, and then down to a minimum of 2.6 on shift 3. So
But isn't that really 4, 4, and 3?
Yes.
I mean,
well,
9.8 is nonsensical.
It isn't, because there's a large, bear with me here, so there's a large component of the force right now that are part-time employees. And so the assumed rounding assumes that this is all full-time equivalent, these are all full-time employees. That isn't necessarily true. There's a pool of part-time officers that can be drawn from to meet the need of a rounding here, a 0.8 or a 0.6. And so that's important to keep in mind here, that what this says, you're right, is that you couldn't fill that with all full-time employees because then you'd end up at 4. But you could fill it with 3 full-time employees and then the equivalent of about a half of a full-time employee through part-time officers. That's what this says.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll point out that there's one flaw with this, maybe beyond what you're trying to point out there, but there's one important flaw that I want to highlight, which is that this goal that we said, where we said, look, we've got a base requirement and then we want to make sure that no more than 60% of officers' time is spent responding to calls, it actually results in a required minimum that's lower than the contractual required minimum of the village, which is 2 officers on at all times, and which is really a best practice anyway. We wouldn't want to have times when there's a single officer on duty. So instead of using these, which get you to here, we actually increased it and said, look, we need a minimum of 2 to meet the goal, which in the end boosts it up only in the 3rd shift because we already had enough to cover that in the first 2 shifts. So the 3rd shift actually comes up so that it's actually also 3.6 full-time equivalents, which when you add it all together is 10.8 full-time equivalents. I did that quickly. Does that make sense? Basically saying, look, we never want to have less than 2, and so in the previous one we had less than 2. If you look at the one here, we had less than 2, so we increased that to 2, and that means we're at 3.6 in the 3rd shift as well.
For the total combined FTEs, you're talking about town and village, correct?
Yep, so now this
It
is,
can be less than 2 if you're dealing with more than 2 in the final solution. Can't
well,
it?
this is trying to portray the final solution, which is both
Right.
departments.
Right, but as a combined force, you don't necessarily need a full 2 on the 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. because we're moving the number to the final. So having 3 means you have more than 2.
Well, so what we want to do is make sure that in the scheduling that happens, there are never any less than 2 available officers for every shift
Right,
combined.
combined.
Yeah, yeah, and
Okay.
so that's what this is trying to say, is that, look, the required officers from the village, we boosted up. Now when you add in the current for the town, we end up with this 3.6, which is enough to ensure that there is always 2 officers on duty. Again, 3.6 allows for vacations, overtime, or sick time, holidays, all that stuff. If you take that 3.6, you can have 2 on duty at all times. That's the method here.
We're talking town and village?
Yes,
2 police officers.
So
on
it's-
duty as a minimum all times.
You think that's more efficient?
I think so.
Really?
Yeah,
Even if there's a medical call?
I think, yeah. I mean,
Even
I
if
think,
there's an accident on Storm King Mountain?
sure.
You think 2 police officers is good coverage?
I think it's sufficient given the information that we had.
Okay,
You disagree?
very much.
Hopefully you're not involved in an accident and
Very
you need a
much.
policeman to come and get you. Because
Okay.
you're gonna have to wait then, because you said, we don't need them.
Okay, point heard. So, I mean, I encourage you, if you have detailed comments, if things
You
want.
have a police background, emergency medical background, or anything like that?
I have a consulting background working with
Consulting.
municipalities on these
Okay.
issues. So I encourage you, if you have specific feedback, recommendations, comments, either talk to me afterwards.
If you have a crime scene going on down in Fort Montgomery, there's no police up here in Highland Falls.
Okay,
That's
Yeah.
more efficient, okay.
so, So there's one final step that we did, and it actually increases that a little bit. We said, look, if we go with these requirements, we basically have straight assignments for each shift, that an officer is assigned basically to shift 1 all week, shift 2 all week, shift 3 all week, which may not be desirable. If we wanted to provide the option to have squads to provide coverage on different times and on different days, then that would increase the number of staff that are required. So we came up with just a theoretical option here for a schedule, and we'd be interested in the chief's reaction and see if this is something that they think would be beneficial. But at the minimum, it would allow for some extra staffing to cover and make the schedule more flexible. And so it involves 4 primary squads, A through D. They each fill a set of slots on the schedule, and then 1 extra squad to cover the remaining slot in the schedule. That increases the full-time equivalents to 15.12 from the 10.8. So now we're providing 15.2 full-time equivalents rather than just the minimum required 10.8. So within that, and with that staffing in mind, we put together a merged department structure that looks something like this. So you can see there's a chief, There's now 1.5 full-time equivalent detectives, which is probably 1 full-time and 1 half-time detective. Instead of dispatch, there's a 1.5 FTE clerk position. This provides 1 full-time and 1 part-time clerk to provide the administrative support to answer the phone for non-emergency calls, or handle walk-ups. And then a lieutenant that's really designed as an oversight for the patrol force, overseeing 4 sergeants, 4 full-time officers, and then a pool of part-time officers required to meet the scheduling requirements and the force requirements at 15.12. Questions?
Yeah, why don't you compare that with the chart of how are we staffed now?
Okay. You want me to go back to that chart?
Oh, I'm sorry. Perhaps, let me see if I've got it right.
Okay.
In the village, there are 30 police officers, including chief.
Okay.
There are 12 full-time.
No, I don't believe that's true. 12 full-time officers in the village?
They only put 5 up there, but that's not accurate. We're understaffed right now, so they use 5 as an example.
What is the current full-time
We have
staff?
5 actively working, we have
The budget, I think, calls for 7?
9 total.
9? Including the chief, so 9 including the chief, yeah. But it's currently at 5 plus the chief, so 6 total, yeah.
Yes, when persons speak.
I'm sorry, may I?
They
Hold on.
identify themselves, so
It's just a question.
we have some idea of
Sure,
who's making.
we can ask. So the question was, can people identify themselves when they speak, just so we know who's asking the question?
Sure. Frank Schmidt.
Great.
I'm reading from your report
Sure.
that you put online. Village of Highland Falls, there are 30 total staff members in the police department. 12 full-time staff members, 18 part-time staff members.
Okay, that includes the dispatchers.
That includes, yes,
That
well,
includes-
we're including all the personnel, right?
Dispatchers and all the part-time pool.
And in town of Highlands, it's 23,
Yep,
and they are all part-time, correct?
right.
So basically 53 people, 13 of which are full-time, with the current staffing for the combined area.
12, I believe, full-time.
I'm
That
just
was the number
reading your
you said.
report as you wrote
You
it.
just said 12, so I'm just going off of what you just said. But I think I would point out that part-time officers, you can count them as, a number.
12, correct.
But you remember, those are part-time officers, those are not full-time equivalents. So when you add that total number together, the 50 employees, or whatever the number is you just said, is not 50 full-time equivalents. That is much lower than that. These involve part-time officers, some of whom are scheduled for very few hours in a given year.
Actually, most of them are part-time, but the fact of the matter is there are 50 people that are there available for a surge if we need.
Sure. Yeah,
And you're now proposing something in the order of how many?
15.12 full-time equivalents plus another 3, 4, 5 employees, so 20. 20 full-time equivalents. That is a very different number than a 50 that involves part-timers.
Well,
So,
12 of that 50 is full-time according to your report, so.
sure, but you can
Big
see
delta.
that this involves more than, we're saying 15.1 full-time equivalents in the patrol force. That's more than the 12 full-time equivalents that you just said. And plus, we've got a pool of part-time officers to supplement that and provide coverage during the schedule. So, I hear what you're saying. My point is just that those are, when you use that number, the total number of people, that is not an apples-to-apples comparison to what we're doing here, which is trying to figure out the number of full-time equivalents required to cover and provide the staffing that's required for the department.
So just to go over real quick, full-time equivalents, you could, from your pool that whoever you hire a part-time police officer that could say, look, I can only give you 2 days a month.
Right.
But he's a shining star and you want to hire him.
Yeah.
But now he's only covering 2 days a month. So your full-time equivalents, you could have 35 people in that pool.
You could have 50 people.
You could have back to the 50 that you have now.
Yeah.
Okay.
It all depends on how you structure that and how much you use those full-time.
And what you can hire.
Yeah.
Jim Reynolds, but wouldn't it be reasonable to presume that although the town doesn't have a dispatch, and they're not counting, you have 0 for dispatch.
Right,
We use the 911 system in the town.
right.
So you would have to presume one person for each shift, based on there's one person for those calls.
No, remember, he's counting the cost, not, it's the cost of a person, not the person itself. So the reason he didn't include dispatch costs for the town of Highlands is because we don't pay.
So,
We don't pay
Yeah,
in the town of
the
Highlands.
town doesn't pay.
The village of Highland Falls pays for the cost of the dispatch service.
so Tim, so what you're saying is there is no cost to the town at all for 911, at all, no cost?
No.
That's not true.
Well, that's what
Well, we're county residents, and part of our county
Right.
taxes pay
So,
for the
so
911 service.
clarification, there's no cost to the town as a municipal entity for dispatch. There is cost for the residents through their county taxes.
Perfect. That,
Yeah.
and that's what I was just.
Yeah, okay, good clarification. Yeah, thanks.
So really, the residents of the village of Highland Falls pay for 2 dispatch services. They, through their county taxes, they pay for the county 911 service, which we don't use, and they pay additionally for a second dispatch service. So,
Well,
Did you have a question?
Charlie, we do use
Oh.
911 here in the village too.
yeah, you've got 2 services, and they're paying for 2 services. Maybe we should pay for 3.
Okay, yeah.
Real quick, I know the town did a, and I don't want to put any town representatives on the spot, but I think a couple of years ago, the town, they spent $1.5 million on their 911 system
Right.
that they put in to help, alleviate the outage issues or the coverage issues that we have
For the
down here.
repeaters.
So I don't know if that's been completely paid off, it might be, I don't know. But I do know that there should be some additional cost
Yep.
because of fuel for gassing generators, or there's some kind of
Yeah.
cost. It might be minimal, I don't know, I'm not exactly sure, but I know that there's a cost factor
That's a good call.
there.
There's 2 things, I mean, that
And I don't
brings-
know if future, there might need to be an upgrade to make that system, which was a private system that they put in, to link up with 911.
Right.
Because again, of coverage issues that we have in the community.
There's a whole set of questions there that I'll kind of call implementation costs
Okay.
that we haven't started yet. Right now, we're looking at operating costs, kind of ongoing operating costs. And, if we zero in on something that feels like it's a reasonable option to pursue, then we look at implementation costs. And there would be a cost for communication systems. If there was a consolidated department, there would probably be a cost for, what seem like trivial things like maybe standardizing firearms or uniforms or, or striping on vehicles. There's a whole set of things that we'll need to look at when it comes to those implementation costs. But the thing to keep in mind is, 2 things to keep in mind. One, those are one-time costs mostly. And that means they count differently than operating costs, which go on every year. And then 2, there's often grant funding, and I'll look at Rob because they have a program that is for implementation of projects that come out of their studies. And so that would be something that we would recommend looking at whether that fits with their implementation grants and then apply for a grant for some of that.
And also, I don't know if you're still in the data collection period, I would also look at, and then maybe Chief Scott has these numbers, there are instances where village dispatch, because of the coverage issue, may cover or help out 911 to locate and reach officers
Yep.
to respond to scenes.
Yep.
So I don't know if what that number is,
Right.
and I don't know if you can attach a cost value to that. That may be something.
Yeah, well, I think this is where we dig in on, is this really the right number of, what, we're changing the title to clerk because I think we want to emphasize that ideally the real emergency calls would get handled in this scenario through 911. But there's still a function here, and when we worked in Hudson Falls recently, they had consolidated into now 911 and they didn't have anybody to answer the phone or even just to let people in, at the front door. And so that's probably not the desirable thing. And so we want to avoid that, be able to provide that assistance in the case that 911 is just having difficulty locating a caller, that kind of thing. So, I think that's where we think about this number, what are the responsibilities, what's the right number there. Any other questions, feedback?
I just have a couple points though. Number one, we don't know about the union cost or negotiations.
Sure.
What's gonna happen there?
Sure,
None of that has been presented tonight.
right,
Number two, we don't know how the town's gonna feel
right,
about all of this.
Right.
They may take a look at this here and say, it's not gonna be affordable for Fort
Right.
Montgomery.
right.
We don't know what it's gonna cost Fort Montgomery residents. Is it gonna be higher?
Well,
Which
that's
I know
what-
it's not gonna be lower.
That's what we'll look at next, because that is a good question, very good question.
Okay, so, and then some of this that you have here is the village, but it's not really consolidated.
Okay? What do you mean?
The numbers are not solid
Okay,
of what you have, but continue.
okay. Well, let me get to your other question about how does this affect people outside of the village, which is a very good question because, well, let me get to that in just a second. First, let me talk about the personnel. So this is the chart of salaries and wages. The reason I bring this up is because I think we've done a pretty good job in this planning stage. We don't want to underestimate wages because there is complicated negotiations to go on with the unions and figure out how this would fit within the existing collective bargaining agreements. So I'll just point out that we tried to, when necessary, err on the side of caution by including either the highest wage in a given position. So if there's multiple employees, let's look at the one that's getting paid the most and let's use that as the baseline for the analysis. It may end up that some of the employees don't qualify for that extra salary, step increases or seniority or shift differentials, but in the event they all did, we've still got the estimate where it should be in that case. So the total personnel costs in this merged department come out to just under $1.5 million. And so we use that to kind of look at the before and after. The current cost right now, when you break up that 1.5 million, is between the town and the village, you've got the 1.168 million that's the current staffing cost for the village, and then about $486,000 for current personnel costs for the town. After the merger, you combine those, and it's a total personnel cost of 1.4, almost $1.5 million. And so you can see it's this step down that represents the savings that we're projecting from current cost to the cost after a merger. And so that's an estimated savings of about $194,000 in personnel costs. And importantly, personnel costs then are the driver of our estimate of other cost savings that could occur. Largely, these are benefits. So if you have a reduction in personnel costs, you have a corresponding reduction in the benefits costs. And so that drives a total savings of about $373,000 after merger, including all those other costs.
Tim,
Yeah.
a quick question for that.
Yeah.
So you have 1.4 million, and if we really went back and looked at that other figure, it was around $3 million.
Yep.
Right? Where does the other 1.6 go in?
That's all the other non-payroll. So it's benefits, it's, fuel for vehicles, it's the vehicles themselves if there's purchases, it's all that other stuff. So
But that's not gonna go away.
Nope.
We'll see that somewhere else, correct?
yeah, except that what we're saying here is that that would go down proportionally to the savings in personnel costs.
Okay.
So that if you have fewer personnel, you have fewer benefits costs, you likely have fewer miles on the vehicle, so they last a little longer, you pay less for fuel, that kind of thing. And so that's what this is all about. This about $194,000 in savings in personnel costs translates to about $373,000 in total savings. Yeah.
Can you just go back one more slide?
Yep.
So you have 4 sergeants which are full-time,
Yep.
4 full-time officers.
Yep.
So a total of 8 full-time,
Yes.
correct?
At the patrol level. Yes.
So right now, we have, how many did we have?
12.
No, but how many do we actually have?
9 budgeted.
9
including-
budgeted.
Including the chief. So we've got.
So I have 4 sergeants, 4 full-time officers, I've got 1 lieutenant full-time,
Yep.
and a chief full-time, so I'm at 10 full-time.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well, actually, we add in then the clerk and the detective, at
okay.
least one of those, our assumption is that there'd be 1 full-time and then a half-time, 1 full-time and a half-time. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 8 is
Okay,
12.
so really, when you go back to the savings, and I'm, a little hazy on some of the line items in the village budget, but you're taking out dispatch is your savings.
In a sense, I mean, I think
Across
there's
the
still
board.
some of that is included in
Because
here.
your dispatch is roughly 300,000.
Yeah. There's a portion of the savings that is the reduction in the cost for dispatch. It's not a full reduction because we're kind of saying that a part of what the dispatch does is administration. It's in the office doing clerical work, and so that's covered by this. But
then
that
that's like
dispatch
8 hours a
function-
day, yeah, right.
Yeah. So, and then the other thing to just make it clear that if we're saying 9 employees, full-time employees are budgeted now, 12 are budgeted in this, how does that generate any savings? Partly it's the dispatch, but the other thing is that the scheduling, although it still can draw from a very large, relatively large pool of part-timers, it involves less total part-time hours than the current schedules do. And so there's if you looked at the total spending on part-time, it would be lower in this merge scenario than it is now.
If everything stays
Yes.
nice.
Yes, if everything stays according to
The plan.
the plan. Yeah.
So Tim, you had a staffing level, it was with the A squad, B squad, D
Yes.
squad. if I recall right, was that showing a reduction of the amount of officers we have on the street? You made a comment earlier about 2 officers. Is that your opinion that that would be an appropriate number of officers for the whole township?
That is our opinion. And that's, let me caveat that with 2 things. That is the patrol force. So during certain shifts when there's either a detective, a lieutenant, or the chief on duty, that's in addition to that minimum 2. So keep that in mind. But that is our recommendation, is that the base level 2 patrol force is what's required.
I just want to go back there again. Driving up here, I see 2 Town of Highlands, motor vehicle pulled over, okay? If you have a fight, which happens up here in Highland Falls and Fort Montgomery, what happens then? What do you call county, you call sheriffs?
That's an option. You call in.
So you let the fight continue until something, if you have a medical call up here,
I hear you. I mean,
10 out of 10 on a medical call up here in Highland Falls, and Pat, you can verify this. Okay, they already got air going and everything before we arrive.
Sure.
If you have 2 police officers that are involved, what happens with that patient? They sit and wait for the ambulance to arrive?
It's a good question. Last night, there was an incident with the police, and all 4 responded, which means there was nobody in Fort Montgomery, and there was no one else in the rest of the thing. So 2, 4, if we have 6 on and 6 responded, if you recall to the larger instances that happened in the south end of the village, we had to call in 4 different municipalities. So there are instances where there's going to need to be 8, 12, 15, but remember, as Tim said, this is an analysis, this is what he does. So this is his first rodeo, and this is something that he's giving us the numbers. This isn't necessarily exactly what's going to happen, and obviously the input from the chiefs, the commissioner, everyone is going to make a difference. He's giving us, these are the numbers that our municipality, similar to a lot of other municipalities that have looked at it, researched it, works, doesn't work, these are the numbers that are coming through. So the input's important, but when you say if we only had 2 on the road, the rest of the town would suffer. We had 4 on the road last night. They all responded to the 1 call because it needed to be. So when do you say there's enough?
I understand that, but you don't say there's enough. And the problem is if we're going to talk being efficient.
Or you're bringing up good points, but I just
But
want
if
to
we're-
make the point that these are the numbers just for the 3rd option that Tim brings,
No,
just for the village.
I understand that, but.
So if you go
but-
look at
but my
another
point-
option,
I-
like
Let me speak,
counties.
please. Let me speak, please.
Oh,
I
me too.
understand, it's been 6 months. Okay, it's 6 months, this is the 2nd meeting that we're having. I thought coming here tonight, I would hear solid numbers. This is what it's going to be. This has not even been presented to the town board yet, which is really going to make the decision on all of this, okay, if this happens. This has not been brought to any unions.
Sure.
They're going to make the decision, hey, listen, it's not safe having 2 police officers out there, we want 3. We're not going to do a contract unless we meet here eye to eye. Okay, so we're having this, and I respect that, and I appreciate that, but I thought tonight would be more, hey, this is what it is. This is the solid.
Your response.
Just one response. When you say the town board hasn't even seen this,
Right.
the village board hasn't even seen this.
Okay,
But on the committee that has seen it, which is why you do it, we have town board members, village board members, and community members. That's why they're on it, to respond back to their boards and let them know. Now, those town and village board members have been given this information ahead of time, so they have had the opportunity to share it with the boards.
and
This is a, excuse me,
Go ahead.
this is a study, not this is what we're doing. This now will go to the town board, and you are correct, the town board has the final decision. But working with the town board over the last 3 years, I know for a fact that it's a give and take. Town board is definitely willing to work with the village so that the town realizes that they are the village. It's Fort Montgomery and Highland Falls. It's just not Fort Montgomery. And that's what we're looking at in the merger. That the town looks at
go ahead.
the entire town. And the town understands that. So that's not something that, you know, the town hasn't seen this, you're doing a wrong study. No, the town had the opportunity through their person, the village had the opportunity through their person. This is not the final. These are the numbers come up, and when you say you expect more, it's how the information gets to the committee. The committee, if you looked at the calendar, had a meeting about a month and a half ago, this meeting was supposed to happen. Information did not get to Tim, which is why he couldn't process it, which is why and that's why we didn't have 1 or 2 meetings for the committee in between, is because Tim was trying to get the information from the department heads. He didn't get the information yet, so there was no point in having another meeting when we had no new information to disseminate. Same thing with this. We're not gonna sit here and give you 1 more page of the process. That's ludicrous. We're here to give you a nice chunk, take it in, look at what's going on, and then we go to the next step. We're also not here to rush it. I would love to keep to the calendar. I would love to stay on point, but things happen. And Tim is not going to give us a watered down study. He is going to do everything to fill the study out 100%, and working with him, and you can ask other committee members, I feel he's doing a good job to make sure there are no balls dropped and there are no blanks to his knowledge. These meetings are there to fill those blanks, because Tim may not have 100% of the information going on. He may not have got it from either chief, because the chiefs are like, maybe it wasn't in their paperwork, maybe they didn't see the email from Tim. I want this too. And someone just brought up, well, what about that? Tim will make notes, get back to the chiefs, chiefs will get back to Tim, and the study will be complete. And when the study is complete, that's when the town and village board will start making more assertive decisions. During this process, I know the village board and I know the town board's representative is giving a lot of input to Tim as to numbers, personnel, buildings, the whole 9. So that their input is being heard and given to the committee.
Well, I hope, and I'm speaking as a taxpayer, okay? I'm looking for, I don't want to hear about the cost of the dispatcher. Because I know, as working on emergency services, I know what the dispatcher is all about down there. It's more than just a cost, okay? And I think a lot of residents in Village of Howland Falls understand that. When we talk about, again, with 2 police officers, you're way off on that. Okay, it's just not going to work.
Well,
I just hear 2 police officers is not going to work out. What you have here, there's a lot of work in this, okay? But this is far from what we have right now. I want to feel comfortable living in Howland Falls. I want to feel comfortable down in Fort Montgomery. I don't think there's been any big talk about the police. I was a town councilman on when we were talking about consolidation of village taking over Fort Montgomery. Okay, and we're back here doing this again. But I appreciate trying to do all of this together, but we have to relate to what's really going on in this community.
Sure.
Okay? There's a lot of happenings in the Village of Howland Falls.
Sure.
We have to make sure that we stop that. We don't want to limit to what we have.
So I appreciate that, and I think the very reason we're here tonight is to hear input like that, to hear input from others, because that's an important part of this study too. I'm not a resident of Highland Falls or Fort Montgomery. I can't speak to the same things that you're saying. What I can do is bring my expertise, my knowledge, my background to analyzing this part of this process. And that's what I've done, and hopefully it sheds some light on this. But it is, in the end, it's, collectively as this unfolds, as the mayor said, and, if a decision is to be made, it'll be made by the town and the village boards, and that's where it comes back to you all as residents here to inform that discussion. So I guess the simple thing to say is thanks for coming. Make sure that, if you have specific comments that you want to see incorporated, make sure to get them to me. And also, I hope to see you at the next public meeting and continue to hear your input. I think, can I just go back and then I'll come back? So, Jim,
Archman.
and
I just have 2 questions. At the first meeting, I believe I heard you say that the final decision on dissolution of a police force is put up for a vote. in the municipality. Is that correct?
So the process is that it is, if the village board decides to dissolve its police department, that act is subject to a permissive referendum, which means that if residents circulate a petition on the matter and it meets the requirements, then it triggers a referendum.
Okay. So
So-
a vote by the people actually
If
makes the
there's a
final
petition,
decision,
then yes.
as long as we
You have
follow
to
the
get signatures,
process.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay. That's point A. Point B is the savings on the next page. Wouldn't you get exactly the same if you were to make the village a super village and consolidate the police force under the chief here?
Village is super, we haven't looked at that option yet. That will be one of the options that we look at in the municipal reorganization part of this study. So stay tuned. I mean, we will answer that question and then it'll provide a point of comparison to this and you'll be able to say, look, this is what the savings are if we just merge the village police department and the town, but then here's the savings if we were to do a consolidation of the town and village as a whole to create a super village.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Do you have a figure for the of the savings on a daily basis?
I haven't calculated it on a daily basis, but what's your thinking there? Is there a particular reason that you?
What does it come, how much do we save on the day?
Well, that would save about $1,000 a day. If it's $370,000, that's about $1,000 a day. Yeah.
Couple things. Anybody doesn't know me, I'm Dan Rickey. I was just recently appointed to the Highland Falls Police Commission. I'm also a retired police chief. So my first point, I'm really kind of torn on. Because when you talk about the staffing, I want to come at it from a police officer thing and say, I want 6 people on the shift. But you can't what if it. You can't. Merv, I know what you're saying, and I think what we're hearing is this is their proposal. Now they're looking for feedback, for numbers, but you have to have something to build off of.
Just to cut you off, I just don't want this to go out to the community, hey, this is the cost, and everybody's gonna go, let's do it.
Okay, but Merv,
That's
do me a
important,
favor.
okay?
Yeah.
Stop cutting people off and.
This
people
is
that
the
are talking.
cost at this proposal.
I just speak for myself, that.
The second thing is, a question was brought up about, well, we gotta resolve the union issues, we do. But it's important for people to understand, this isn't the first time around.
Right.
There's 4 relatively local municipalities that have done this already. The town and village of Havenstraw, the town and village of Saugerties, the town and village of Warwick, and the town and village of New Paltz.
Right.
So, those things aren't insurmountable. And I guess right here is where I should say for the record that, done correctly, I 100% support consolidation, done correctly.
Right.
But I think a word got thrown out and it's important people understand that this gentleman here said, there's a huge difference between dissolution and consolidation. Under dissolution, the town has no say.
Right.
They get the police department. They have no say in it whatsoever. I mean, really what I think you want is consolidation. You want an agreement, you want everybody on the same page. Because if the village votes to dissolve the police department goes away.
We agree with that. At the original meeting, the statement was made to dissolve a police department, you have to have a vote,
can.
a
You
vote
don't have
take
to.
place.
It can be forced.
You
Yes,
can.
we can force a vote, and that way the people get to
Correct.
make the decision.
Okay.
But you still don't have a
Which is what we wanna
result,
do
you don't know how it's
at the
gonna go. So it's suppose you did that and they voted, yes, let's dissolve. Then you're in a world of hurt because poor June over here now adopts a police department, or has to police this village from scratch.
Still, the people have to make
So-
that decision.
There's been
It's
some
not the
planning
board, the one.
on the town's part.
Oh, no doubt.
Just in case that happens.
No doubt.
You guys are shell shocked.
But consolidation is the way you should be going.
Okay, so Jim and
So
then Jim.
just real quick on while we're talking about consolidation and dissolution and all that, I think it's important that we do keep the channels of communication open, because I see the supervisor weekly, and the supervisor of the town of Highlands has not been engaged properly. That's just my opinion, and if you ask him, whether it's Mike Randall from the Record or News 12, give him a call. Bob lives here, and he will tell you that the communication through his office has been nil.
Okay.
Now, I'm not referring to whether June Gunza comes to a meeting, who's a councilwoman on the town board, or Bill Etzel, who's a member of the committee.
Right.
The supervisor of the town of Highlands, who's the chief fiscal officer for the town, is not being engaged properly. So whatever anybody's saying about that, and Pat and Mayor, you can say that you are, I'm just saying that what he has said is that he is not being
He's
engaged
expressed
properly.
that concern, and I think
He's
we've
expressed
got
it
a
to you too.
committee. Yep, so, but I
Thank you.
think we've got a committee
Thank
that, the idea of the committee was to have
So I would
representatives.
suggest the news media is just touch base with him a little bit, because you are giving a good presentation. And look, some of the numbers we're not gonna be happy with, and it is, it's just an idea, it's a plan. We don't have to choose to have, to do the plan.
Right, right.
As far as,
Information.
Yeah, it's information.
now,
Information.
as far as if Bob is informed properly or given what's going on, it's an open meeting. He's more than welcome to come. His representative is at the meeting to bring the information back to the town, including Bob. So as far as, and Bob has not expressed anything to me that he is not informed, which to me means Bill Edsel is giving him all the information that is coming from the committee. If Bob, and this goes out to anyone, if Bob's talking to anyone saying they're looking for information from the village, Bob's got all my numbers. My cell, my home, he's called them all.
Right.
So if anybody is talking to Bob, please have him call me directly. And we'll make sure, but Bill Edsel is the representative for the town, and he's the, and I know he's very engaged in the meetings, and he will be bringing the information back to the town.
Real quick, and I don't wanna belabor, I don't wanna go back and forth, but if you're the mayor and he's supervisor, you can call him. You're potentially, you have a plan of giving up, potentially, your police department. You should have some kind of dialogue with the supervisor, that's all I'm saying.
Okay, Jim.
Sound like your previous slide. The crossing guard, you had one, and we have 3 schools.
Okay,
We have the Sacred Heart School, which is a private school.
yeah.
And then we have the one on Mount Avenue. And then we have the one down in Fort Macomb. So how did you arrive at one? And maybe it might be something you want to think about.
Full-time equivalent.
Well, it's actually, I think this is one part-time, and I think that we didn't intend to make any change here. I think this is straight from the current budget. So I don't know if that 8,000 covers 3 part-timers maybe, is probably what's going on.
Yeah.
But we haven't reduced it.
All right, I was
Whatever it
just-
is now is what it is there.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah, that doesn't cover, that doesn't even barely, mostly covers one.
Well, I'll go back and make sure that we didn't drop a 0 or something, but that's what we took this directly from the budget, didn't alter that. So maybe
You might have just
something-
took my figure because I gave you one, so.
Okay, well, we'll go verify that and make sure, because our intention is not to say there's any reduction in the
Yeah,
crossing guards.
and
That's
we'll
not-
have feedback, you and I
Yeah,
will communicate after this.
Good, let me get to the final couple things here. So this is the kind of conclusions from this. The merger of the town and village police departments could result in some significant savings. This is part of what we were charged to look at, was opportunities for savings through municipal restructuring or through service restructuring. And that we feel that there's a way to do that merger with staff reductions that are accomplished through attrition rather than through layoffs or through loss of current employees. The new structure, through our analysis, I think we've demonstrated, though there can be disagreements about what is necessary in a community, that it provides coverage above the minimum requirements based on call volume. We've created a couple ways to make sure that there is sufficient coverage based on that call volume. And then as we fully expect and see this in other communities, that as a department goes through this merger, if they choose to do that, then there's a process through which over a couple years, there can be a streamlining of operations. After that merger takes place, things are hairy at first, but then once the department gets its kind of groove and is able to think of how to streamline those operations, there are usually savings down the road a couple years later. The challenge that comes out of this, though, that we haven't even talked about yet, is one back to the gentleman's comment earlier, that what does this do to the town's budget? We've talked about the savings on the police department, but we haven't talked about either the town or the village budget. What does it actually do to the budget? And so let me quickly explain, and this will make your head hurt. I do this all the time, and as we were driving up here, I was explaining it to Peter, and it made my head hurt. So bear with me, but I think you'll see that this makes sense. So first of all, the initial thing to point out is that if we were to go with this as designed right now, there's obviously changes to be made based on some comments, but if we were to go with this as described right now, there would be a decrease in the village budget equal to the current cost of police services, which we estimated about $2.4 million. Then there would be an increase as the town takes on those costs through a town police department that's expanded of about $2 million. So that's a problem. Like, we can point out right now that if you don't do anything, that's a problem.
You can show the 820 people.
Yes, so the important thing to note is that if the village police department goes away, there's this savings to the village budget, increased cost to the town. That cost right now is covered in the town's outside budget. it would shift instead of from the outside to the town-wide budget as a reflection of the fact that it's a service that's provided now town-wide, not just in the outside part. So that's step one. Remember that an increase of $2 million in any cost in a small tax base of an outside part of the town is a very different thing to your taxes than an increase to the town-wide. Town-wide, everybody shares, and so it's less of an overall increase. But it's still an increase, which is back to the point that without any adjustment here, this would result in an increase to the residents outside the village. But that's not the way that this has to happen. There is enough savings here in the village to more than make up for that increase and make sure that residents outside the village don't see an increase in taxes. To do that, and this is where it's a little counterintuitive, would take some sort of transfer from the village to the town in the amount of about $400,000. That's a very small amount compared to the total savings here, but that's the amount that it would take to make sure that you hold harmless the residents outside the village.
Could you explain the A and B plan again, so people understand? The $2 million is not $2 million to Fort Montgomery.
Right.
The $2 million is, $2 million is the full town, which approximately two-thirds of that is the village. So of 2 million, is 2 million the total or just the increase?
Total.
2 million is the total budget now.
No, that's the increase.
Right, so we're
about
talking about
2/3 of that is.
Total budget would be approximately 2,700,000?
Total, I don't remember what the fund
2.8,
is.
so it was 700,000-ish.
435.
Well, this is now Fund A, so this is
what I'm
what
saying.
makes you the head hurt,
Yeah,
right?
435. It was
No,
that
no,
easy.
that's the Fund B. That's the Fund B budget, right? So the Fund A budget is higher than that. What I'm saying, and that I think,
No, what we have to understand is Fund B,
Yeah, but then,
the 435, add that to the 2 million.
right.
Now you have, let's say, 2,400, round it. $2,400,000. Two-thirds of that is spent by the village.
right,
1/3 by Fort Montgomery. What's 1/3 of 2,400,000?
1.6 million,
800,000.
2/3.
One-third.
He's saying Fort Montgomery.
Oh, okay.
1/3. So 800,000. That's what we're talking about, and that's where the 400,000
So they'll
transfer
pay more.
comes in.
They'll pay more.
no. So
This is exactly what he's saying. Wait.
if you didn't have some sort of transfer between the village and the
Oh,
town,
yeah.
you would pay more.
Correct.
But this is the key mechanism here, and I think the mayor's explanation of it is a better explanation in terms of understanding the Fund A, Fund B distinction. But the key takeaway is that in order to make sure that there isn't any increase to town outside residents, there needs to be a transfer from the village to the town-wide fund of $400,000. And so that is achievable given the significant savings to the village. There's still a savings of $2 million in the village, so still a reduction in taxes in the village, but that transfer ensures that residents outside the village don't see an increase in their taxes. It's all the moving pieces of Fund A, Fund B, and village gets very complicated very quickly. So hopefully that helped and didn't hurt.
What happens with existing debt
Existing debt of the department,
of both departments?
it stays where it is. So any existing outstanding liabilities.
Personnel, anything like that?
Yep, any personnel, post-employment benefits, theoretically, if there was a lease on a vehicle or something, that could be negotiated, but, okay. All right, any other questions?
Yeah.
Can I go over here first, Jim, and then I'll come back to you?
Nick Cobo, if you had a dissolution of the village, what is the proposal for dealing with the bond indebtedness?
We haven't gotten there yet. So that's part of the municipal reorganization part of the study, and we will get to that once we finish the service reorganization. The simple answer is that in most dissolution situations, that debt stays with the residents in the former village area.
That's standard.
B1.
There's also ways to reduce that through when we consolidate. But we can't, and even as the village, I'm not looking with a consolidation for Fort Montgomery to take on any debt. I don't follow that, but understand that water and sewer are two separate funds. Water debt would stay with the water and their appropriate districts. Sewer would do the same, and then just the village debt itself would stay inside the village when we reorganize. Tim, if we can move along, I just have two other people that I would like to speak.
Sure. I think that's basically it for me. I'm going to talk about quickly the next steps here. We obviously, through today's discussion and through our next meeting with the committee and then conversation with the town and the village boards, verify all this, make sure that we get all the input, And then when we're ready with an option that seems like it's worth pursuing, then we would develop the implementation plan, back to the question of, figuring out some of these one-time costs that might be associated with it. And then next, we'll move on to the municipal reorganization study. Probably our next public meeting would be sometime in the mid-October timeframe.
There's another key question.
Sure.
In that same scenario, what becomes of the village's key asset of the water resources?
I guess if you're talking about like the source of supply and the water plant, is that what you're talking about? That would continue to be used to provide water services through a special district. And so it would become technically an asset of the town because the village would no longer exist. Those assets would be transferred to the town, but it would be employed in the service of that water district that would be formed in the event of a dissolution.
If you're transferring an asset of a great deal of value,
Yeah.
it would seem to me that the village residents who are then going to become responsible to pay off the bonded indebtedness would receive fair market value for the key assets that are being transferred to the separate entity.
We will go through in detail how that works when we get to the municipal reorganization part, and in certain instances, you're exactly right. In other instances, if the asset is going to continue to be used to benefit the same individuals, there may not be a need for a purchase of that asset or a compensation for that asset.
I think that there's need to give very specific details
Yeah.
of how the village residents going into the future, which may not be the same as the village residents now, are going to be responsible to pay off $9 or whatever $1 million
Sure.
bonded debt.
We will. We will definitely get into lots of detail on that in the next stage of the study.
Thank you.
Rob, question, comment?
Just Rob Roble with the Department of State. Just so you know, you talked about additional funding to the Department of State. For implementation of, let's say you were to do an implementation of the consolidation of the police departments, the town or the village, you have one applicant, but you'd be eligible for up to $400,000. That's $200,000 for both the town and for the town and for the village for 2 applicants. So depending on the cost, you could spend up to, the state would be able to provide up to $400,000 to help with the implementation of your police merger.
One time only.
One time only. The Village of Saugerties received the same thing. They did some major renovations on one of their buildings. And again, if you implement the merger of your DPW at some point, the same monies would become available at that time. Again, it is through the consolidated funding application, and you can move forward. It's a yearly deadline. There's another fund that we've just come out with, which is the Municipal Restructuring Fund, and that's based solely on your savings. So, and it's a percentage of your savings over a 10-year period.
And Rob, if we fully consolidate the program that the state is running right now, what are we looking at?
If the village and the town consolidate into a single entity, you would receive, you could receive up to similar funds, depending on how you apply through the program, but you would also receive through what's known as the Citizens Empowerment Tax Credit, because you're removing a layer of government, up to 15% of the current town tax levy and the current village tax levy, up to $1 million in annual payments to the town, the resulting town remaining entity.
How many, through your application process, I'm sure it's not, you just guys are, the state's just handing us a blank check. So I'm sure you have to qualify for the application process.
You have to, if it's for the $400,000,
The 2 and 2.
Well, the 2 and 2.
Just go to that.
For the $400,000, that's through the consolidated funding application. But because you're implementing something that normally scores very well.
Okay, so if
in the
they
process,
don't.
it is a competitive process.
If they don't implement one of the plans, because that was stated too, that we just might do a hybrid or something and.
If you do the hybrid, you're still eligible for up to the $400,000 for that project.
Okay, and how many communities have applied for it and gotten it? Just a rough figure.
Because not everybody implements these types of things, but overall, in the last 10 years, we've handed out $26 million, something like that, to 260 projects.
And on the 800,000 one, it's an annual contribution?
Well, which 800?
You said up to $1 million.
That's the Citizens Empowerment Tax Credit.
Yeah.
That's if if the village dissolves or the village and the town consolidate into a single entity.
Okay.
That's an annual payment.
And how many communities have applied and gotten that?
Currently, they're funding 13 of them.
Where are they located?
Well, they're different villages. The village of Keysville dissolved, village of Seneca Falls dissolved, Pike.
You're talking about Buffalo?
Most of, well, Keysville's north, but many of villages have dissolved. Those are mainly they occur through village dissolution. Currently, there's several towns that are looking at consolidating, and they would be eligible for that money also.
And can you just enlighten everybody on what specifically the money can be used for?
With the
Well, the 400,000. How does that
400,000,
get
it's
used?
implementation funding. Like with Socrates, we paid for upgrades to vehicles, we paid for new vehicles, we paid for new uniforms, we paid for additional structural capital improvements on the property. So that it can be used for pretty much those things: equipment, capital improvements,
Legal
fees.
yeah.
Legal fees can also be included as part of that. Consultant services, contractual expenditures, and legal fees. So, and then that is, again, it's a grant, so it is, we will pay up to 90% of your total costs. So anything over 400,000, you would be responsible for.
Okay.
With regards to the Citizens Empowerment Tax Credit money, if the village and the town consolidate, the 70% of that must be used for tax relief. So 70% of that money must be used to reduce taxes. The remainder can be used for anything, general municipal purposes.
And that can go on forever?
As long as the state legislature keeps approving it.
Free money from Albany.
Thank you very much, Rob, I appreciate that. Also, our new chairman of our police commissioner, our police commission has a letter. We've reached out to several different municipalities that have consolidated police, Dan actually knows several. One already reached back to him, and several have reached back to him. They couldn't make it tonight. They are willing to talk to us and let us know what they incurred. But one wrote a great letter back to Dan, and if you would share that with us at this time.
Thanks. I just want to preface by saying, I know when this position of police commission came up, a lot of people were talking about out-of-towners. I want you to know I'm not the guy from the town of Middleborough. I lived in Highland Falls for 25 years. My boys went through the school system here. I started on the Highland Falls Police Department, and I was a village trustee for 6 years. So I care about this place. So I want you to not think that it's just somebody's coming in to tell you folks what to do. But I reached out to Joe Snodra. He's the chief in Saugerties. He's also the president of the Mid-Hudson Association of Chiefs of Police, and he's a member of the Board of Governors of the State Association of Chiefs of Police. And he wanted to come tonight, but he's on vacation. He's supposed to take his wife somewhere, and which argument do you think won there? But he did write a letter. You want to read the whole thing? You want to just read it?
Real quick, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, listen. Basically, he just wants to thank us, he wants to thank me for providing the opportunity to speak to the village board. He can't make it, but he would be happy to be here at any time in the future. And he's hoping that this communication will serve in the place of his presence here. He was not a member of Saugerties when it took place. He came in a year later, but he was the deputy chief in the adjacent town of Ulster. So he was very familiar with it. So what he says here is, throughout the process, both the town police and the village police publicly, with respect to who could provide the better, battled publicly with respect to who could provide the better service. I don't really think that's happening here now. I don't know if it will down the road. It's certainly not open warfare, but that's a situation they ran there because they were both pretty much full-time departments. And what he says here, and I think is really important, is he saw this as a problem with an issue of both the town and village government properly addressing the crux of the consolidation. If I could jump in and out of the letter, just because it gives me the opportunity to say, if you don't like something, the way to defeat it is to scare people. We need to listen to the facts, we need to listen to the committee, we need to trust our elected officials, we need to ask the questions. But you can try to make a village better while you're tearing it too. And I think a little bit that's happening now. There's different camps, there's a lot of disinformation being put out. I would ask everybody, I would urge everybody to go with the information provided. But basically, what happened there, that being the collaboration and bringing forth the best police agency possible to provide the best service possible to the community they serve. Had the officers been edified in the positive outcomes of consolidation, that being a larger police agency, a greater resources, continuity of communications, and consistency in services, he believes the steps leading up to transition would have been free of continuous efforts on both sides to sabotage the possibility of consolidation. He gave a lot of credit to his town and village government for the role they played, for getting information out, to not be caught up in the tactics and the disinformation that was being put out there. So the big question remaining was how to merge the two agencies in one cohesive police force. The first hurdle was to overcome was the differences in two agencies' contracts. We talked about that a little bit. The town and the village police had two different bargaining agents, and they were represented by two different unions. I think here they're the same, right?
No, they're different.
The towns is different. They're not for Sulfaro's deal. Okay. Eventually, what happened in that case was that the village police officers accepted the terms and conditions of the town CBA with the police department. Issues such as seniority, vacation picks, steps, longevity, and such were all worked out prior to the merger. It took them 6 months. They worked it all out, and he's suggesting, which I think we're talking about here, is that the village opt to merge rather than go to public referendum, in other words, dissolution, as doing so tends to promote a sense of unworthiness between the village residents and the town residents. I'm sorry, village officers and village residents. In other words, what he's saying is, if you just want to dissolve, are you sending a subliminal messages to the village officers you don't even care about them? Which that's not what the village is looking to do here now. They're looking to consolidate. Basically, the town and village of Saugerties provide police service to 19,000 residents. Certainly, what we're here about 5,200 townwide, I guess. That sounds about right. 19,000 town and 4,000 village, so they get 23. 60 square miles, and basically he throws a lot of numbers here. But here's, out of this big letter, here's what I got, and I think it's so important. This happened in 2010. It went to a vote in 2010. It passed on a 2-to-1 majority. In 2010, the combined budgets of the two departments was $2.5 million. So on January 1st, 2011, when the combined Town of Saugerties Police Department took effect, they used $2.5 million as the baseline because that's what they were used to. Today, in their 2016 budget, the police budget is $2.35 million. 6 years later, it's $150,000 less than it was then. They have more officers, they have more equipment, they have a little more of everything. So, I think it's fair to say, you may not see the huge savings on day one. You may see a slight bump. But if you look down the road, I think, and listen, I live in the village. I understand how people feel. All I'm asking is go with the info and make an informed decision. But Chief Sinatra is willing to come down. I'm sure I could also get Chief Snyder from the village of New Paltz and Chief McGovern from the town of Warwick. Maybe we could even have some kind of panel discussion. But I think it's important to hear from somebody that's done it as opposed to, gee, I don't get it, I don't know. So,
Thank you.
that's all.
And I'll just point out, not to toot our horn, but I think it's important for you to know that we did the study that led to that merger. And, I think that's the same method that we bring to this study, is the study that led to that I think part of what we try to do is be conservative about our estimates so that over time, it's even more savings than what we project. And so that's our approach to this study.
Good to go?
Yeah, good to go.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you everyone for coming tonight.